Sir, my father was never buried in the right place. The boy's trembling voice stopped Henry Lawson in his tracks. The desert wind carried those words deep into his chest, stirring the ghosts he thought he'd left behind. Brothers lost in a faraway war, graves that never bore their names. His shepherd, Bear, lifted his head and began barking, low, insistent, toward the old Ridgefield mine, long sealed after the deadly collapse of 1987. The locals said it was empty, but Henry felt something breathing beneath the silence, something unfinished. He turned to the boy, voice rough. "What did you say your father's name was?" The air grew still, heavy with what neither of them yet knew. Some souls never rest until the truth is found. Stay with us through the end. Like, share, and subscribe, so that faith, courage, and loyalty can light the darkness once more. The evening sun of Nevada bled red across a desert of dust and ruin. Heat shimmered above the sand, and the wind carried with it the faint metallic tang of rust and old stone, a smell that clung to the ghosts of Ridgefield Mine. Once, this valley had echoed with the hum of drills and laughter of men. Now it was a hollow graveyard of tin roofs and broken machinery. Henry Lawson walked the length of the perimeter fence with the slow, measured gait of someone who no longer hurried for anything. He was in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate and silent. His once military posture had softened into a stoic slump, as if the desert itself had pressed down on his spine. The sun caught the silver in his short brown hair, and the shadow of his stubble darkened the sharp line of his jaw. He wore a faded flannel shirt, red and gray, and the same pair of worn jeans he'd owned for years, tucked into scuffed boots that knew more dirt than pavement. His face was marked not by age but by memory. Faint lines creased the corners of his eyes, carved by years of watching too much and sleeping too little. There was a quiet about him that wasn't peace, but exhaustion, the kind that doesn't fade, only settles. Beside him trotted Bear, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat of black and tan that caught the dying light like burnished metal. His build was solid and powerful, his movements confident yet cautious, ears twitching at every gust of wind. His amber eyes held the deep intelligence of an animal that had seen too much, yet trusted one man enough to stay. Henry often talked to Bear the way one speaks to a brother, gruffly, sparingly, but with more honesty than he used on any human. "Looks like we've got another storm coming," Henry muttered, his voice rough from disuse. Bear flicked an ear but said nothing, padding beside him as if to confirm the obvious. The wind had changed direction, cold and sharp, sliding through the gaps in the chain-link fence like a whisper. Henry stopped near the old shaft entrance. Mine 3. A wooden sign, weathered to gray, hung crooked on a single rusted nail. "Keep out. Collapse risk." He knew the words by heart, yet he found himself staring at them longer than usual, as if they might suddenly tell a different story. The Ridgefield collapse had happened 38 years ago. Dozens of miners buried alive when the lower shafts gave way. The company that owned the mine had filed bankruptcy 2 weeks later, and Ridgefield became a ghost town overnight. Henry wasn't from here. He had arrived 5 years ago, after walking away from a war and from everyone who still tried to reach him. The local council had hired him as a caretaker to keep vandals away from the ruins. The job suited him. There was no one to talk to, no one to disappoint. He could sit in silence, and the silence would not judge him. But silence had a sound here, a faint hum that rose with the wind, the mine, exhaling through its broken mouth. Henry leaned on the wooden rail and looked into the dark opening. The tunnel yawned like a wound that had never healed. "Still breathing, aren't you?" he murmured. Bear paced near the entrance, his nose low to the ground. The dog's tail stiffened, then wagged once. He began to dig, paws flying, sending dirt and small stones backward in rhythmic bursts. "Easy, boy," Henry said, stepping closer. "What have you got there?" Bear barked once, low and sharp, then backed up, revealing something small half buried in the dust, a glint of metal. Henry knelt, brushing the dirt away with calloused fingers. It was a toy car, a miniature military jeep, the paint long gone but the metal surprisingly intact. On the underside, faintly etched, were words that made his breath catch. To Dad. Come home soon. Henry's throat tightened. The desert wind whistled through the mine entrance, and for a moment it sounded like a child's whisper. He turned the toy over in his hand, feeling the weight of it. Not the metal, but the message. He looked at Bear, who was watching him quietly, head tilted. "Where the hell did this come from?" he muttered. The toy was too well preserved to have been lying here since the 1980s. Someone had left it here, recently. Henry glanced at the entrance again. A faint, cold draft rose from within, carrying the smell of wet earth and iron. The hair on the back of his neck lifted. "Let's go, boy," he said. They returned to the small guard station near the perimeter, a one-room cabin with a tin roof and a single desk covered in dust. Henry placed the toy jeep on the table beside his battered thermos and opened the old filing cabinet that held the mine's inspection records. The papers inside were brittle and yellowed, but he sifted through them carefully. Incident report, Ridgefield Mine Collapse, June 1987. He spread the document flat and scanned the list of names. Some he recognized from local gravestones, others meant nothing. Then his eyes stopped at one. William Bill Tanner, foreman, Shaft 3. The name hit him like a kick to the chest. Bill Tanner. The memory came sharp and sudden. A night sky in Afghanistan, gunfire cutting through the air, and a man's voice shouting over the radio, "Lawson, get your men out!" Bill Tanner had been a sergeant then, tough as nails, with a dry humor that could slice through fear like a knife. He'd taken a bullet meant for Henry, and laughed about it as the medevac hauled him away. Henry had written him once after the war, but the letter came back. Address not found. He'd assumed Tanner moved on, maybe found peace somewhere quieter. And here he was, dead, buried under this desert 30 years ago. Henry sank into the chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "Christ, Bill, what were you doing in Nevada?" The silence pressed in, heavy and intimate. Bear lay down by the door, his chin on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Henry stared at the toy jeep again, the inscription burning in his mind. To Dad, come home soon. He wondered if Bill had a son, someone who had waited for a father who never came home. The thought made his stomach twist. He picked up the toy and turned it in his palm, feeling the dented edges, the tiny wheels that no longer turned. The desert outside groaned as the wind shifted again, a long, mournful breath that rattled the tin roof. Somewhere deep within the mine, a loose sheet of metal clanged like a bell. Henry looked toward the sound and felt something old stir inside him, a sense of unfinished duty. He had buried his past once before, and like this mine, it was refusing to stay buried. He poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. His reflection in the window was barely visible in the twilight, a man fading into the dust. He thought about Tanner, about that night when they'd both sworn they'd make it home. Only one of them had. "Maybe you did come home," Henry whispered, staring toward the mine. "Just not the way you meant to." Bear lifted his head, ears pricking at the tone of his master's voice. Henry sighed and crouched beside him, scratching behind his ear. Guess we've got something to look into tomorrow." The dog gave a quiet huff, the kind that sounded like agreement. The night crept in slow, wrapping the desert in blue and silver. The wind whispered through the broken beams of the mine, and for a heartbeat Henry thought he heard a faint, hollow echo. 3 slow knocks from deep underground. He froze, listening. But there was only silence, vast and absolute. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for you to speak first. Morning came to Ridgefield with a pale, unforgiving light. The desert sky was washed in tones of silver and ash, and the chill that lingered before the day's heat felt almost merciful. Henry Lawson sat on the steps of the guard cabin, a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Bear lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed yet alert. Every gust of wind carried the faint echo of the mine's breath, the hollow exhalation of a place that should have died long ago, but hadn't. Henry's mind kept circling back to the toy jeep. It sat now on the edge of the desk inside, gleaming faintly in the slanted morning light. He hadn't slept much. The name Bill Tanner had dug through layers of dust in his memory, unearthing things he'd tried for years to bury. Laughter in desert camps, the sound of artillery, the smell of blood and burning sand. Bill had been the type of man people followed without question. Square-jawed, sun-creased, quick with a joke even when bullets were whining overhead. Henry had seen him bleeding out once, his grin defiant as he'd said, "You're gonna owe me a beer for this, Lawson." But there'd never been that beer. Only a grave in a desert. A rattle of glass startled him from the thought. Down the hill, near the rusted fence that marked the edge of the property, a small figure was picking through the debris. Henry squinted, the light sharpening around the shape. It was a boy, no more than 10 or 11, thin as a reed and moving with the restless precision of someone who had learned to find value in other people's trash. He wore a too large flannel shirt tied at the waist with rope and jeans torn at both knees. His hair was the color of desert straw, uncombed and wild, and his skin carried the tawny hue of a child raised under hard sunlight. When he turned, Henry caught a glimpse of his face, sharp, wary eyes the color of honey, the kind that missed nothing. Henry stood, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Hey!" he called out, voice cutting through the stillness. The boy froze, clutching a metal bucket that clanged against his leg. Bear lifted his head, ears twitching. "You shouldn't be out here," Henry said, walking closer. "This land's restricted." The boy hesitated, weighing his options, then straightened, chin high in quiet defiance. "Ain't hurting nothing," he said. His voice was thin but steady. "Just picking scrap. People dump stuff near the old shaft. I sell it to a guy in town." Henry studied him. Up close, the boy looked even smaller, bones showing beneath the dirt-smudged skin. Yet there was a self-reliance in the way he stood, like a stray who had survived too many kicks to fear another. "What's your name?" Henry asked. "Eli." "Eli what?" The boy hesitated, eyes narrowing. "Tanner." The name hit Henry like a hammer. He kept his face neutral. "You got family around here?" "My ma. She works nights at the diner down the Boer highway." Eli's gaze flicked toward Bear, who was now standing, tail low but wagging. "He yours?" "Yeah," Henry said. "Name's Bear. Don't worry, he won't bite unless you give him reason." Eli crouched and extended a tentative hand. Bear sniffed, then pressed his head against the boy's fingers. The dog's acceptance was instant, instinctive. Henry felt an odd tightening in his chest. "You live near town?" he asked. Eli nodded toward the cluster of derelict houses half a mile away. "We stay at number 4. Used to be foreman housing. Ma says we'll move when she saves enough for the city." He spoke flatly, as if he didn't believe it. Henry noticed the bucket the boy carried. Inside were bits of copper wire, bottle caps, a broken watch face, and a strip of fabric embroidered with faded letters, possibly from an old uniform patch. Henry's stomach turned. "You shouldn't be digging near the mine. It's not safe." Eli's expression hardened. "Safe don't pay for dinner." For a moment, neither spoke. Wind hissed through the broken fences. Then Eli looked past Henry toward the dark hole of the mine entrance. "You ever hear it?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" "The knocks." Henry frowned. "Knocks?" Eli nodded, voice dropping to a whisper. "At night when it's quiet. 3 knocks, always 3. Ma says it's just the wind in the tunnels, but it's not. It's them, the ones who didn't come out." Henry studied the boy's face, trying to decide if he was teasing or telling the truth. Eli's eyes, wide and solemn, held no mischief, just certainty. "You sure you didn't dream it?" Eli shook his head. "Sometimes I go up there when the moon's high. You can feel it. The air gets thick, like it's waiting. Last week I found a man's boot near the fence. Still had a foot bone in it." Henry exhaled slowly. "That's enough ghost stories for one morning. You hear me? You keep away from that place and you don't come back." But Eli didn't flinch. "My dad was in there," he said. "He never came out either." The words hung between them. Henry's mouth went dry. "Your dad, he worked in the mine?" "Yeah, Bill Tanner, foreman, Shaft 3. The name confirmed what Henry already knew, but hearing it from the boy made it real. He felt something sharp pierce through the shell he'd built around himself. Bill Tanner's kid, the child of the man who had once dragged Henry bleeding from a burning Humvee. "I'm sorry," Henry said quietly. "That was a long time ago." Eli's face stayed hard, but his voice cracked a little. "Ma says he's buried under there, but she don't visit. Says it's bad luck to cry for someone the earth's already claimed. But he ain't buried. Not really. He's still down there, waiting." Bear whined softly, stepping closer to the boy as if sensing the tremor beneath his words. Henry cleared his throat, forcing his tone to steady. "Look, kid, I knew your father, a long time ago." Eli's eyes snapped up. "You did?" "Yeah. We served together in the army before he came back to the mines." The boy's expression shifted. Shock, then hunger. "Then you know what happened?" Henry hesitated. "Not everything, but I'm trying to find out." Eli stared towards the mine again. "Then maybe you should listen for the knocks, too." Henry almost smiled, despite himself. The boy had his father's stubborn streak. "I'll keep that in mind." The sun had climbed higher, turning the desert to gold. Henry watched Eli sling his bucket over his shoulder. "You got far to go?" "Town's 2 miles, Eli said. "I can walk." Henry frowned. "Wait." He stepped inside the cabin and came out with a canteen half full of water and a small wrapped sandwich left from the night before. He handed them over. "Take these." Eli hesitated before accepting. "Thanks," he mumbled. "You're not like the other guard. The last guy used to throw rocks at me." Henry snorted. "I'm too old to waste good rocks." The ghost of a smile flickered across the boy's face. He turned to go, then paused. "Mr. Lawson?" "Yeah?" "Don't tell Ma I come here. She'd be mad. But if you find out anything about my dad, will you tell me first?" Henry looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Yeah, kid. You'll be the first to know." Eli's face softened, and he gave a small nod before heading down the dusty road, his bucket clanking at his side. Bear watched him until he disappeared behind the ridge. Henry stood there long after the boy was gone. The desert heat began to rise, rippling the air. He turned toward the mine, where shadows pooled like ink around the entrance. Bill Tanner, he murmured. You left more behind than I thought. Inside the cabin, the toy Jeep gleamed faintly in the sunlight. Henry picked it up again, tracing the etched words with his thumb. To Dad, come home soon. He set it down beside his rifle, as though the two belonged together. Bear moved to his side, tail thumping once. Looks like we've got work to do, boy, Henry said. The dog's ears lifted, and for the first time in years, Henry felt something alive stir beneath his ribs. Not hope, exactly, but the faint beginning of purpose. Night fell over Ridgefield like a heavy curtain. The wind, once dry and sharp, now carried a damp chill from the desert's edge. A thin moon hung low over the broken machinery, its pale light glinting off the old mine signs like the gleam of forgotten bones. Henry Lawson stood near the chain-link gate, flashlight in hand, scanning the silent expanse. Bear trotted ahead, his paws soundless on the gravel, nose twitching. The dog's fur shimmered faintly under the moonlight, his breath forming small white clouds. Henry checked his watch. Past 11. The company's night patrol schedule was long abandoned. He'd volunteered for the shift out of habit rather than necessity. Routine was what kept the ghosts quiet. The desert was still, except for the low groan of the wind threading through the collapsed shafts. Henry's eyes swept across the familiar terrain, the rusted rails, the bent support beams, the yawning black mouth of Mine 3. Then Bear froze. The German shepherd's body went rigid, head lifted, ears pricked forward. He let out a low, guttural sound, half growl, half whine, and began moving toward the rocky ridge behind the main shaft. "What is it, boy?" Henry whispered, following. Bear led him along a narrow path behind the main pit, a place Henry rarely ventured. The terrain there was uneven, scattered with shale and loose stones. When they reached the base of the ridge, Bear stopped, pawing at a patch of loose sand beneath an overhang. Henry crouched down and felt it, a cold draft, faint but unmistakable, rising through the cracks. His flashlight beam traced the rock face. The pattern of sediment didn't match the surrounding formation. Someone had filled it in, recently. Henry brushed away loose dirt, revealing a slab of concrete smeared with dust. It wasn't part of the original mine wall. He pressed his hand against it. Air seeped through the edges, cold and metallic, like the exhale of something buried alive. "Jesus," he murmured. "You found a vent." Bear whined softly, tail low. Henry moved his light along the ground, spotting something half-buried near the base of the slab. A metal tool, newer than anything else here. He picked it up, a carbon steel rock hammer, industrial grade, with the paint still fresh. It wasn't from the 80s. Someone had been working this area recently. He stood, scanning the ridge. The silence was wrong. Too thick, too expectant. Then he heard it, a faint metallic clank, echoing through the stone like a heartbeat. He killed his flashlight, crouching low. The sound came again, rhythmic this time. Tools. Someone was digging inside. Henry followed the sound around the ridge until he reached a narrow crevice. There, partially hidden by a fallen beam, was an old ventilation shaft. Half collapsed, but open enough for sound to travel. He knelt beside it, leaning close. The faint murmur of voices drifted up. "Move the rest before sunrise. Keep the lid tight. Radiation levels are already spiking. Don't worry about the inspector. Once the waste is sealed under, no one will come looking." Henry's pulse quickened. The words were muffled, distorted by distance, but clear enough. He could make out at least 3 different voices, men speaking in low, hurried tones. The occasional scrape of metal against rock punctuated the conversation. He strained to listen, pressing his ear closer. The report said the last collapse buried everything. We're just making sure it stays that way. The company wants no traces left. Henry felt his stomach tighten. They were talking about the Ridgefield collapse, the so-called accident. And if they were moving containers of radioactive waste, it meant the mine hadn't been just a workplace. It had been a dumping ground. The collapse wasn't tragedy. It was cover-up. Bear shifted uneasily, letting out a small growl. Henry placed a hand on his back, a silent command to stay quiet. Through the vent, the voices faded, replaced by the dull hum of machinery. The air that seeped through was foul, tinged with chemical rot. He backed away slowly, mind racing. For years, Ridgefield's story had been written off as bad engineering. But this changed everything. If the company was back here, sealing evidence, then someone was funding a cleanup operation outside official oversight. The thought filled him with a familiar cold, one he hadn't felt since Afghanistan, when truth and orders had often stood on opposite sides of the same gun. Henry rose, brushing the dust from his knees. "Come on, boy. We're done here for tonight." Bear hesitated, nose pressed to the crack in the stone, growling low. Then he turned and followed. As they descended toward the cabin, the moon slipped behind a cloud, and for a moment the entire valley went black. Inside the cabin, Henry locked the door and laid the rock hammer on the table beside the toy Jeep. Two artifacts, one from the past, one from the present, and both whispering the same story. He poured himself a shot of bourbon from the small flask he kept for bad nights. It burned his throat, grounding him. Bear settled by the stove, eyes fixed on him, waiting. Henry stared at the tools for a long while before pulling out the old map of Ridgefield. The blueprints were hand-drawn, the ink faded but legible. He traced the shafts with his finger, stopping at Section 3, the collapse zone. The vent he'd found wasn't on any diagram. Someone had built an extension later, off the record. He remembered the equipment he'd seen near the ridge. Steel cables, fuel drums. A thought struck him. Whoever was down there hadn't left yet. They were probably planning to move out before dawn. He debated calling the county sheriff, but the thought died quickly. The Ridgefield Sheriff's Office had a reputation for selective hearing, especially when the mining company was involved. And Henry had no proof, just whispers and dirt. He needed something tangible. He turned to Bear. "We go back tomorrow. Daylight. I want to see what they're hiding." Bear tilted his head, as if understanding. Henry leaned back in the chair, exhaustion setting in. But sleep wouldn't come easily. His mind kept circling the words he'd heard. "Seal it under. No one'll come looking." He thought of Eli, Bill Tanner's boy, and the toy Jeep. If Bill had worked this section, he might have known what the company was hiding. Maybe he'd tried to expose it. Maybe that was why the shaft had collapsed, with him inside. Henry felt a knot tighten in his chest. He'd told himself he came to Ridgefield for peace. But peace was never real. It was just waiting for the next noise, the next unfinished story. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere far below, deep in the earth, a sound echoed faintly through the ground, a hollow thud followed by two more. 3 knocks, slow, even. Bear's head lifted, ears pricked. Henry froze, listening. The sound came again. 3 knocks, faint but deliberate, not wind, not echo. He stood, flashlight in hand, heart pounding, but the next moment, silence reclaimed the valley. Only the desert wind answered him. Henry lowered the light, his face unreadable. "Yeah," he muttered to himself. "Tomorrow." He glanced at Bear, whose eyes gleamed in the dark like twin embers. The dog gave a soft whine and laid his head down, but his gaze stayed fixed on the door. Outside, the desert exhaled again, the long, tired breath of a world trying to bury its own sins. The morning came dull and gray, a low ceiling of clouds pressing down over Ridgefield. The usual shimmer of desert heat was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Henry Lawson sat by the window of his cabin, the remains of last night's coffee cold in his hand. On the table lay his notes, the mining maps, and the rusted toy Jeep that had become both a mystery and an accusation. He hadn't slept. The voices he'd overheard in the mine vent still echoed in his mind, words about radiation, inspectors, sealing things before sunrise. Bear paced near the door, restless, tail twitching with unease. The dog's eyes kept darting toward the ridge, where the mine sat like a sleeping beast. Henry noticed the behavior but dismissed it at first. "Easy, boy," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "We'll go soon." He meant to drive into town, maybe talk to Sheriff Dorman, though he doubted it would do much good. Sheriff Dorman was the kind of man who had grown too comfortable behind his desk. Stocky, in his late 50s, with a face reddened by years of whiskey and sun, he was known more for keeping peace than seeking truth. Ridgefield was his last post before retirement, and he made sure no trouble stuck long enough to make it into a report. Henry imagined the conversation already. Illegal miners? Radiation? "That mine's been closed for decades, Lawson. You've been breathing too much dust." Before he could decide otherwise, Bear suddenly barked, short and urgent. The German shepherd spun toward the door, growling low, then lunged forward. "Bear!" Henry barked back, but the dog ignored him, bolting outside and down the gravel path toward the mine. "God damn it!" Henry grabbed his jacket and flashlight and sprinted after him. The wind cut cold through the valley as he ran, boots crunching on the gravel. Bear was already a blur ahead, tail streaming, paws throwing up dust. "Bear!" Henry shouted again. But the dog didn't slow. It wasn't panic, it was purpose. Henry had seen that look before, in combat zones, when bomb-sniffing dogs locked onto a scent too strong to ignore. At the same time, in the distance near the broken road into town, a small figure spotted the commotion. Eli Tanner was walking towards the outskirts, a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He stopped, squinting. Bear, Mr. Lawson's dog, was racing alone toward the mine. No Henry in sight. His chest tightened. Without thinking, he dropped the sack and ran after the animal. Eli's thin legs carried him faster than he'd thought possible. The road was long and uneven, but he knew every shortcut, every slope. When he reached the ridge, he saw Bear disappear behind the fallen scaffolds near Mine 3. The boy hesitated only a second before following. "Bear," he called softly, afraid to shout too loud. The dog's bark echoed faintly from inside the tunnel. Meanwhile, Henry reached the mine, entrance, panting. The old warning sign lay half buried in dust. The air smelled wrong, freshly disturbed, laced with diesel fumes. His pulse quickened. Someone had been here recently. He stepped inside, beam of light cutting through the dark. The tunnel walls glistened faintly with moisture. Bear's tracks, fresh paw prints, led deeper into the shaft. "You stupid mutt," Henry muttered, his voice tight with both fear and affection. The deeper he went, the stronger the stench of fuel became. Then, movement ahead. Shadows flickered against the far wall, and voices carried through the stone. "We'll blow the rest of it and close the entrance. No one will ever find this place again." Henry pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering. He peeked around the bend. 3 men stood near a stack of crates. They were dressed in mining gear, the kind used in modern excavations: hard hats, neon vests, respirators hanging from their necks. The leader was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, short black beard streaked with gray. His name tag read, Carter. Carter moved with the authority of someone who didn't ask questions. He gave them. His dark eyes scanned the tunnel as he spoke. Make it clean. Once this last charge goes off, the company gets its silence, and we get paid. One of the others, younger, nervous, adjusted his helmet. Sir, we've got movement on the outer sensors. Dog or something. Carter's expression hardened. Then blow it fast. Now. The men scrambled to arm the detonator. Henry's instincts kicked in. He turned to run, but before he could, Bear burst from the shadows, barking furiously. The men spun, startled. One of them dropped the detonator, his finger brushing the switch. The explosion tore through the shaft like a thunderclap. The ground heaved. Henry was thrown backward, hitting the wall hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Dust filled the air, choking, blinding. Bear yelped somewhere in the chaos, and the light from Henry's flashlight vanished into swirling gray. Then, silence. No, not silence. A deep, grinding rumble as part of the ceiling gave way. Henry staggered to his feet, coughing, waving dust from his eyes. The entrance was gone. A wall of collapsed rock sealed it completely. Bear! He shouted hoarsely. The dog's answering bark came faintly through the haze. Henry stumbled toward it. His flashlight flickered back to life, revealing a narrow path still open through the debris. He followed the sound, limping, until he saw movement. A small figure crouched near the fallen beams. Eli? He gasped. The boy turned, face pale beneath layers of dust. His eyes were wide with terror. Mr. Lawson, I saw Bear run in. I tried to... Then it... Don't move, Henry ordered, forcing himself forward. He caught the boy by the arm just as another tremor shook the tunnel. Behind them, something groaned. A sound that could only mean more. Collapse. We have to get deeper inside, Henry said. Now! Eli hesitated, trembling, but Bear appeared beside them, tail low, pressing against Henry's leg as if urging him on. They stumbled farther into the mine, away from the caved-in section. The light dimmed to a faint amber glow as Henry's flashlight struggled against the dust. After what felt like hours, they reached a small chamber, one of the old side passages where miners used to rest. The air was thick and damp, and water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Henry leaned against the wall, chest heaving. Eli sat on the ground, shaking. You hurt? Henry asked, scanning him. The boy shook his head. Just scared. Good. Stay close. He checked his radio. Static. No signal. They were cut off. Completely. Henry cursed under his breath. The realization settled over him like a cold weight. No one knew they were here. Bear circled the chamber, nose twitching, then stopped near a narrow fissure in the wall. He pawed at it, whining. Henry crouched beside him. A faint current of air moved through the crack. Fresh. Clean. Somewhere beyond that wall, the mine still breathed. Henry pressed his forehead against the stone. We'll find a way out, he murmured. I promise. Eli looked up at him, tears carving streaks through the dust on his face. Do you think my dad was down here when it happened? Henry's throat tightened. Yeah, he said softly. I think he was. The boy swallowed. Then maybe he's still here. Henry didn't answer. The weight of the earth above them pressed heavy, a reminder of the lives lost, of Bill Tanner, of the secret buried with him. He looked at Bear, whose eyes gleamed in the dim light, steady and fearless. We'll find him, Henry said finally, and we'll make sure no one else gets buried down here again. The dog gave a low bark, as if agreeing. Somewhere deep below, the mine sighed, a low moan of shifting stone, the breath of the dead beneath the earth. The air in the collapsed mine was thick as tar, filled with dust so fine it felt like breathing ground glass. Every breath Henry Lawson took burned. His flashlight flickered, casting shaky circles of light across the broken beams and stone. The silence that followed the explosion was immense, pressing against his eardrums until the faint sound of dripping water felt deafening. Somewhere behind him, Eli coughed, the sound small and frightened. Bear paced between them, the low rumble in his chest echoing like distant thunder. Henry wiped blood from a cut on his forehead. "You all right, kid?" he rasped. Eli nodded mutely, his face streaked with grime, eyes wide and reflective like a startled animal's. The boy's clothes were torn at the sleeves, and his hair was thick with dust. He looked impossibly young in that moment. Fragile, but with a spark of defiance that reminded Henry too much of someone he used to know. "Stay close," Henry said, his voice calm despite the pounding in his head. "And don't wander. Bear will lead." The shepherd's ears pricked, head turning sharply toward a gap in the wall. There was air movement there, faint but steady. The dog barked once, short and commanding, then pushed his nose into the debris, pawing feverishly. Henry understood. "He's got something," he said. Together they cleared enough rock for a small passage. Beyond it was a narrow corridor lined with ancient support beams, blackened by age and rot. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. Eli clutched Henry's sleeve, whispering, "It feels like the air's breathing." Henry's light cut through the dark, illuminating faded markings on the wall, numbers, letters, and old chalk notations from the original miners. "We're in one of the lower maintenance shafts," he muttered. "Didn't think these were still intact." They followed Bear for nearly 10 minutes, until the tunnel widened into what looked like an abandoned control room. A door half buried under rock leaned open just enough for them to slip through. Inside, the air smelled of rust, oil, and something older. Decay. Bear stopped suddenly, stiffening, then gave a deep, mournful bark. Henry swung the flashlight toward where the dog stood. The beam found a body. It sat slumped against the far wall beneath a collapsed support beam, half covered in rubble. The skeletal remains wore the remnants of a miner's uniform, the fabric stiff with time and dust. A rusted nameplate clung to the shirt pocket. Tanner. Henry froze. His throat closed as the name burned itself into his vision. He knelt slowly, brushing the dirt away from the corpse's hand. The fingers were wrapped around a weathered, leather-bound book, its cover blackened but intact. He pried it free gently, brushing dust from the embossed initials on the front. "BT. "Bill," he whispered. Eli stared, his lips trembling. "That's my dad?" His voice broke on the last word. Henry didn't answer right away. He looked at the remains, the way the body was positioned, curled slightly forward as if guarding the notebook even in death. There was something in that posture, a final act of will. "Yeah," Henry said softly. "That's him." He sat back on his heels, the weight of it sinking in. He remembered Bill Tanner as he'd last seen him. Alive, loud, laughing through a bullet wound, promising to buy him that beer once they were both out. Seeing him now, reduced to bone and dust, felt like a betrayal of time itself. Henry flipped open the journal. The pages were brittle but legible, written in cramped, urgent handwriting. The entries were technical at first, dates, maintenance logs, load capacities, but then the tone changed. Shipment number 12, hazardous drums, unauthorized, corporate orders to store deep section. Radiation warning ignored. We protested. Supervisor said it's above our pay grade. Something's leaking. Workers sick. One collapsed today. If they shut us down, truth dies with us. And then, near the end, they're sealing the shaft tomorrow. We're the ones left to finish the job. No one will come for us. I can feel it already. The humming in my bones. If anyone finds this, tell Eli his father kept his word. Henry's hands shook slightly as he reached the last page. The ink there had bled from moisture, the letters trembling as though written by a dying hand. If anyone reads this, tell my boy I didn't run. I stayed. I kept the promise. I made it home. Eli stepped closer, tears cutting trails through the dirt on his face. He wrote that for me, he whispered. Henry swallowed hard. He did. Bear whimpered softly, lowering his head beside the remains, tail still. The gesture was solemn, almost human. Henry closed the journal, holding it against his chest for a moment before tearing out several of the pages, the ones containing the technical details, the names, the proof. He slipped them into his jacket. The rest he placed back in Bill's hands. Some things belong where they're found, he said quietly. Before he could say more, a sharp crack echoed above them. Pebbles rained from the ceiling. The walls groaned, a low, grinding sound that filled Henry's gut with dread. "Move," he shouted. "Now!" Bear barked, spinning towards the passage they'd entered through. Henry grabbed Eli's arm and ran. The ground shuddered beneath their feet as part of the ceiling gave way behind them. Dust exploded into the corridor like smoke. They ran until Henry's lungs burned, until the noise faded into echoes. Finally, they stumbled into a larger shaft supported by thick beams. Henry stopped, gasping for air. Eli was crying silently, clutching his father's helmet that he'd picked up from the floor. Henry rested a hand on his shoulder. He stayed because he believed the truth mattered, he said. Now it's on us to make sure it sees daylight. The boy nodded, wiping his face with a dirty sleeve. Bear whined again, tugging at Henry's jacket. The dog was facing a narrow tunnel ahead, one not on the old maps, half buried but open just enough for a man to crawl through. Air flowed through it, cool and fresh. Henry crouched, shining his light inside. That's our way out, he said. Eli looked at him fearfully. What if it closes too? Henry smiled faintly, the expression weary but determined. Then we make another way. That's what your father did. They crawled toward the narrow opening, Bear leading the way, his body brushing the jagged stone. Behind them, the mine groaned again, settling into a long, tired exhale, the sound of a grave returning to its silence. As Henry pushed forward, he whispered, Rest now, Bill. We'll finish what you started. Ahead, a faint glimmer of light broke through the darkness. The tunnel was closing behind them. The earth moaned like a dying giant, sending clouds of dust rolling through the darkness. Henry Lawson could barely see past the beam of his trembling flashlight. The air was thick with grit, every breath scraping his lungs raw. Behind him, Eli clung to his shirt, coughing, eyes wide and terrified. Ahead, Bear pushed forward through the narrow crawl space, his dark coat turned gray from dust. The dog's right paw dragged slightly. He was limping. Keep moving, boy, Henry said hoarsely. His voice sounded small against the roar of collapsing stone. Bear didn't look back. He never did. The shepherd's instincts were sharper than any man's. He could smell air, life, freedom, even through tons of rock. Henry trusted that sense more than he trusted maps, more than he trusted himself. The tunnel was no wider than a drainage pipe. Sharp rocks tore at Henry's shoulders and back as he crawled. His flashlight flickered, catching glimpses of fractured timbers and glistening veins of mineral running like scars through the stone. He thought briefly of Bill Tanner, still entombed somewhere behind them, the notebook clutched in his bony hands. I made it home. The words burned in Henry's head. Eli's voice came, small but steady. He's hurt. Henry looked ahead. Bear had stopped, panting heavily. His right leg trembled, bent at an unnatural angle. The sight stabbed through Henry's chest like shrapnel. He crawled to the dog, setting the flashlight down. Blood streaked the shepherd's paw, dark against the dust. "Easy, buddy," Henry murmured, running a calloused hand along Bear's side. The dog's breath came in short bursts, but his eyes, amber and alive, still burned with the same fierce focus. He nudged Henry's arm forward with his nose. The message was clear. "Keep going." "Not without you," Henry said. He looked back at Eli. The boy's face was streaked with tears and dirt, his small hands trembling. "Eli, we're close. You see that?" Henry pointed ahead where the tunnel narrowed even more, ending in a faint shimmer, a sliver of light breaking through the stone. Eli nodded shakily. "Is that outside?" "Yeah," Henry said. "That's daylight, kid. You crawl first. Bear and I will follow." "I won't leave him," Henry smiled faintly. "You sound just like your father." Bear gave a soft growl, half a warning, half encouragement. Henry tore a strip from his shirt, wrapping it tightly around the dog's injured leg. "Hold on, boy," he whispered, then slung Bear's body over his shoulder. The dog was heavy, over 70 pounds of muscle and loyalty, but Henry didn't hesitate. The tunnel shook again. Pebbles rained from above. A deep boom echoed somewhere behind them, another section collapsing. Henry's ears rang as he shoved Eli forward. "Go, crawl!" Eli scrambled towards the light, coughing and choking. Henry followed, dragging himself, with one arm, holding Bear with the other. The air grew fresher with each foot forward, carrying the faint scent of rain and pine. Then, all at once, Eli broke through. Henry saw the boy's small body vanish into brightness. "Come on, Henry," Eli's voice echoed from above. With a final heave, Henry pushed himself up through the narrow gap. The tunnel spat them out into a dry riverbed. The pale dawn sky stretched above like salvation itself. Henry collapsed to his knees, gasping, the cold morning air slicing into his lungs. Eli knelt beside him, his small hands fumbling to help pull Bear out of the hole. The shepherd emerged covered in dirt and blood, his breathing ragged. Henry laid him gently on the ground. The dog's eyes fluttered open. For a heartbeat, he looked at Henry, then at the rising sun, before resting his head on Henry's lap. "You did it, boy," Henry whispered, his voice breaking. "You got us out." Bear's tail twitched once, weakly, as if he understood. They sat there for a long while, bathed in the soft gold of morning. The world felt too quiet, too alive. The mine behind them had gone still. Its monstrous breathing finally stopped. Hours passed before the rescue crews arrived. The sound of engines and shouting voices broke the silence. Men in orange suits swarmed down the riverbed, their helmets glinting in the sun. A woman led them, a paramedic named Marla Green, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and gray eyes that missed nothing. Her hair was tied in a tight braid, streaked with silver, and her voice carried the firm authority of someone who'd seen too many tragedies and refused to freeze before the next one. She knelt beside Henry, checking his pulse before turning to Eli. "You two are lucky to be alive," she said. Her tone was brisk, but not unkind. "We picked up seismic activity last night. Thought it was just another collapse. Then we saw the smoke." Eli clutched the small toy Jeep in his hands, the metal now dulled and dented. "We found my dad," he whispered. Marla's expression softened. "Then I think he'd be proud you made it out." Henry watched as Bear was lifted onto a stretcher improvised from a rescue tarp. The shepherd's chest rose and fell faintly. Henry followed beside him, his steps heavy. Take it slow, Marla instructed her team. Dog's in shock. When they reached the medical tent near the ridge, Sheriff Dorman was waiting. He looked worse than Henry remembered, his uniform wrinkled, hat in hand, eyes shadowed by guilt. Lawson, he muttered, you're a hard man to find. Henry's glare could have cut through stone. You knew something was going on in that mine, didn't you? Dorman hesitated, his lips twitching. Orders came from higher up. State contracts, reclamation work, none of us were supposed to dig too deep. Bill Tanner did, Henry said coldly, and it killed him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the torn, soot-stained pages from Bill's notebook. Not this time. Dorman took the papers, scanning them with growing horror. Christ almighty. Give them to the feds, Henry said, not the company. You do that much right? Maybe you'll sleep again. The sheriff nodded slowly, shame in his eyes. I'll make sure it's handled properly. Henry turned away, his focus drifting back to the tent where Bear lay on a stretcher, breathing shallowly. Marla knelt beside the dog, her hands steady as she cleaned the wound and wrapped it with gauze. He's a tough one, she said quietly. Might just make it. Henry exhaled, the first real breath of relief since the collapse. He always does. Later that morning, as sunlight spilled over the ridge, an unmarked white van arrived. Federal investigators, their jackets bearing the insignia of the Environmental Bureau. They took the evidence, the sheriff's statements, and marked the Ridgefield site as a federal crime scene. For once, the truth would see daylight. Eli sat on a boulder nearby, holding the toy Jeep in his lap. His small hands turned it over and over, polishing the dust from its surface. He kept his promise, didn't he? The boy asked softly. Henry looked down at him, exhaustion etched deep into his face. Yeah, he said, and you helped him finish it. Eli nodded, then leaned gently against Henry's arm. Bear, bandaged and drowsy, raised his head to watch them. His eyes, bright even in pain, caught the reflection of the morning sun. Gold against gold. Henry placed a hand on the dog's neck. You're the reason we're standing here, he murmured. My light in the dark. The desert wind swept through the valley, carrying the smell of rain and dust, the sound of distant sirens fading away. Behind them, the mine lay buried under its own sins, sealed by rock and silence. For the first time in years, Henry felt something close to peace, not the kind born of forgetting, but the kind earned through surviving. He turned toward the horizon where the sun burned brighter now, and for a moment, in its light, Bear's fur glowed like fire. A year had passed since the mine breathed its last. The Ridgefield Valley, once scarred by greed and silence, had changed its face. The broken scaffolds were cleared away, the rusted rails removed, and where the blackened entrance once yawned, now stood an open courtyard of white stone. The Ridgefield Memorial for Bill Tanner and the miners of 1987 shimmered softly under the early Nevada light. The wind carried the faint chime of metal bells strung along the hill, a sound gentle enough to almost hide the memories buried below. Henry Lawson stood at the edge of the courtyard, his frame outlined against the rising sun. He was leaner now, his hair more silver than gray, his flannel shirt faded at the shoulders. The deep lines around his eyes had softened into something calmer, as if time had finally dulled the war's edges inside him. Yet his posture remained steady, soldierly even in rest, as though he were guarding the quiet itself. Beside him lay Bear, older now, his muzzle white with age, one leg still carrying the faint stiffness of that day in the tunnels. The German shepherd's eyes, though slower to move, still burned with warmth when they found Henry's face. He wore a simple harness now, engraved with a brass tag that read, Ridgefield Guardian. Every morning, Henry walked the perimeter of the memorial before the first visitors arrived. He checked the plaques, polished the lanterns, and brushed dust from the engraved names with the same care he once used cleaning his rifle. Some mornings, he spoke aloud to the stones, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about nothing at all. It made the silence less hollow. The memorial itself was modest, a circular platform surrounded by 12 steel pillars, each etched with the name of a miner lost in the 1987 collapse. In the center stood a statue of a man kneeling beside a child, both gazing upward toward a shaft of open sky. The sculptor, Maria Ellis, had been a quiet woman in her 50s, short and solid, her hands perpetually coated in clay and plastered dust. She'd lost a brother in another mine disaster years ago and worked silently for months shaping the figures in her studio. When the tarp came off on the day of unveiling, Henry remembered her standing there, tears streaking through the dust on her cheeks. Now, that statue gleamed under the new dawn, light catching on the boy's face as if he were forever about to speak. From the road came the crunch of gravel beneath tires. Henry turned. A blue pickup truck rolled to a stop near the gate. The driver's door opened, and Eli Tanner, now 11, jumped out. He was taller than before, his frame less fragile, but his eyes, the same honey brown as his father's, still carried that quiet intensity. His clothes were clean but modest, a plaid shirt tucked neatly into faded jeans. Behind him stepped his mother, Rachel Tanner, a woman in her late 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her face bore the kind of strength carved by endurance, soft-featured, but lined with small traces of worry that had learned to stay. She worked now at a small diner in town, the same one she had once used to escape her grief. There was a steadiness in her gaze as she watched her son walk toward the memorial. She no longer cried when she came here, only breathed deeper. "Morning, Mr. Lawson," Eli called out. His voice had grown surer, but it still carried the politeness Henry admired in him. Henry smiled. "Morning, kid. You're early." Eli shrugged. "Wanted to come before it gets busy. Mom said the city folks are bringing flowers today." "Yeah, they like to show up for the pictures." Henry's tone carried a hint of humor. "They'll take photos, say a few words, and drive back to air conditioning." Rachel chuckled softly as she approached. "And you'll still be here polishing plaques when they're gone, won't you?" Henry grinned faintly. "Someone's got to keep this place honest." Bear pushed himself up slowly, padding toward Eli. The boy knelt to greet him, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. "Hey, Bear," he whispered, "you're looking better." The shepherd wagged his tail lazily, resting his chin on Eli's knee. Henry watched the scene in silence for a moment before turning his gaze toward the statue. "Still carrying that little thing?" he asked. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the small toy Jeep. The metal had been cleaned, though the scratches remained, each one a reminder of its journey through fire, dirt, and time. He walked up to the largest plaque, the one bearing his father's name, and placed the toy on the stone ledge beneath it. "Morning, Dad," he said quietly. "It's sunny today. You'd like it." Rachel stood behind him, her hands clasped in front of her. The wind caught her hair, lifting a few strands around her face. She closed her eyes briefly, mouthing words only she could hear. Henry stepped closer, resting a hand on Eli's shoulder. "He'd be proud of you," he said. Eli looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know. He kept his promise." Henry nodded. "Yeah, he did." They stood there together for a while, the three of them framed by the morning sun. The bells on the hill clinked softly, and somewhere far off a hawk circled lazily in the open sky. After a time, Rachel turned to Henry. "You ever think of leaving here? Doing something else?" He smiled faintly. "This is something else." She studied him, perhaps understanding. "You don't owe anyone anymore, Henry." He looked toward the dog, who had settled in the grass, muzzle on his paws, eyes half closed in the warmth. "I owe him," he said simply. "And Bill. And maybe myself." Rachel nodded, not pressing further. She had learned that some men needed silence more than comfort. By noon, more visitors arrived. Families, journalists, a few old miners in wrinkled uniforms. Henry moved quietly among them, answering questions, guiding people through the site. The mayor gave a short speech, the kind that sounded rehearsed but sincere enough for the moment. Cameras flashed, and for a few minutes, Ridgefield became more than a forgotten desert town. It became a story of redemption. As the crowd thinned, Eli remained seated beside Bear, running his fingers through the shepherd's fur. "Do you think he remembers the mine?" he asked. Henry chuckled softly. "He remembers everything. Dogs like him don't forget. They just forgive." When the last car pulled away and the valley fell quiet again, Henry, Eli, and Bear were the only ones left. The light had turned amber, washing the white stones in gold. Henry lowered himself to the grass beside them. "Pretty soon, he'll need more rest," Rachel said gently, watching Bear's slow breathing. Henry nodded. "Yeah, but not today." He reached out, laying a hand on the dog's head. "We made it home, didn't we, boy?" Bear's tail brushed against the ground once, a soft rustle like the turn of a page. The bells on the hill rang faintly again as the wind shifted through the valley. It carried the scent of wild sage and iron, the sound of time passing gently. Henry looked toward the horizon where the sun was rising higher, lighting every name on the memorial. "Come on," he said, standing. "Let's go get breakfast. The day's too good to waste." Eli rose beside him, smiling. Rachel followed. Bear pushed himself up with effort, his movements slower but sure. Together they began the walk down the dusty path toward town. The veteran, the miner's son, and the dog who had led them both out of the dark. Behind them, the wind moved through the metal bells again, and their faint chime rolled across the valley like a benediction. Soft, steady, endless. Sometimes miracles do not come with thunder or divine light from the sky. They come quietly, through courage, loyalty, and the simple will to do what is right. In the stillness of the desert, Henry, Bear, and Eli found something greater than survival. They found grace. It was not the kind of miracle that changes the laws of nature, but the kind that transforms hearts, the kind that reminds us that God still works through ordinary people and faithful souls, even in the darkest tunnels of our lives. When you face your own shadows, remember that faith is not the absence of fear, but the strength to keep walking until light appears. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a sign of hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe, and help us spread stories that remind the world of God's quiet miracles. May the Lord bless you, protect you, and guide you toward your own light, just as He guided them out of the dark.